Dominic Sterling returned after 3 months away, expecting to walk back into power. Instead, he walked into his own company and found his wife sitting in his chair, not hovering near it, not standing beside it waiting to hand it back, sitting in it, comfortable, composed, running a meeting that had clearly started without him and showed no intention of stopping. The executives around the table hadn't looked up when he entered. That was the first thing that hit him. These were people he'd hired, people whose salaries he'd approved, people who had once straightened their posture when they heard the elevator doors open on the 42nd floor. Not one of them reacted to his presence. They were watching Vivian, which brings our third quarter performance to 18% above projections, she was saying, one hand resting on the armrest of his custom-ordered chair, like she'd forgotten it had ever belonged to anyone else. The restructuring I proposed in August has exceeded every benchmark. We've recovered the losses from second quarter and positioned ourselves for aggressive expansion into— What the hell is this? Every head turned. Vivian's eyes met his last. No surprise, no guilt, no apology formed behind her expression. She looked at him, the way you look at someone who has arrived late to something that no longer requires them. Dominic. She said his name without standing, without pausing, without giving the moment any more weight than it had earned. You're late. The company couldn't wait for you. The room stayed silent. Not the nervous silence of people witnessing something they shouldn't. The silence of people who already knew how this ended. Dominic forced a laugh, the kind he used to reset rooms that had stopped responding to him. Okay, very funny. Vivian, I appreciate you keeping things moving, but sit down, Mr. Sterling. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved, but the words landed with the full weight of someone who no longer needed volume to be heard. Dominic looked around the table. Julian kept his eyes on his laptop. Rebecca studied her coffee. David Park, who usually cracked first under any pressure, found something deeply interesting about his own hands. Nobody was coming to his rescue. Nobody looked uncomfortable with Vivian's authority. They'd accepted it completely while he was gone. This is my company, Dominic said slowly. That is my chair. And I am not sitting in the middle of a table in my own boardroom like a— Was your company, Vivian corrected, her voice still carrying that same unbothered calm. Was your chair. Past tense, Dominic. A great deal has changed in 3 months. I'd suggest you sit down so I can explain exactly how much. She gestured to an empty seat, not at the head of the table, not anywhere near it. A middle chair on the far side, the kind reserved for junior staff invited to observe proceedings they had no authority over. Dominic's jaw tightened. I'm not sitting anywhere until someone explains why my executive team is taking orders from my wife. Your wife, Vivian said quietly. And something in the way she said made the words carry more history than he was prepared to face in public, the one you left behind to manage everything you walked away from. Yes, she set down her tablet and gave him her full attention for the first time. That wife. The board would never. The board voted unanimously. Her voice was level, precise. 7-0. Your seat was forfeit the moment you violated the morality clause in your own contract. While you were away, I gave them a choice: continue with a CEO, facing federal investigations, active lawsuits, and a public relation crisis costing $3 million a week in lost contracts. Or let me fix what you broke. I didn't break anything, Dominic said. The words sounded hollow, even to him. You broke everything. Vivian stood now, not for theater, but because she was done conducting this conversation from a seated position. You broke trust. You broke this company's foundation. You broke every assumption I'd spent years making about who you were. She walked toward him slowly, unhurried. I'm just done waiting for you to notice. What would you do if you walked into your own company and found everything had changed without you? Drop your answer in the comments and make sure you're subscribed, because this story is only getting started. Dominic Sterling was the kind of man who filled rooms before he entered them. His reputation arrived first, whispered in conference calls, referenced in industry profiles, dropped casually at cocktail parties by people who wanted others to know they'd met him. At 38, he'd built Sterling Enterprises from a struggling tech startup into a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, that Fortune 500 companies paid obscene amounts to fix their broken systems. He was brilliant. Everyone said so, including Dominic. Board members straightened their spines when he walked past. Competitors studied his moves like chess players analyzing a grandmaster. Junior employees practiced their pitches in bathroom mirrors, hoping for 30 seconds of his attention in elevators. The media loved him. Young, handsome, quotable. He had confidence that looked like vision and ambition that photographed well. Business magazines put him on covers with headlines like "The Man Who Makes Chaos Profitable" and "Why Every CEO Should Think Like Dominic Sterling." He believed every word. At home, in the Pacific Heights penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, Dominic would stand at those windows with a scotch in hand and talk about the future like he'd already purchased it outright. "We're going to double revenue next quarter," he'd say. Not to Vivian specifically, just to the room. "Julian thinks it's aggressive. But Julian thinks everything is aggressive. That's why he's CFO and not CEO." Vivian would be curled on the couch with her laptop, reviewing contract language or running market analyses. Work that happened quietly in the margins of Dominic's spotlight. She'd learned early not to interrupt these monologues. They weren't conversations. They were performances she was expected to witness and affirm. "You're going to do something extraordinary," she'd say, because she believed it, and because saying so used to make him look at her like she was the only person in the room who truly understood him. Now he just nodded, like she'd confirmed something he already knew and hadn't needed her to say. People forgot that Vivian had been there before any of this existed. Not at the first board meeting or the first major contract signing. Before that, back when Sterling Enterprises was 3 people sharing a rented office in Oakland, before the awards and the profiles and the magazine covers, when success was still theoretical, and Dominic's confidence was threaded through with a kind of private desperation that woke him at 3 in the morning. She'd met him at a startup networking event she'd attended reluctantly, pulled along by a colleague who thought she needed to get out of her own head more often. Dominic had been pitching to a venture capitalist who looked thoroughly bored, and Vivian had watched him fumble the close, watched the opportunity slip away because he'd oversold the vision and completely undersold the fundamentals. She'd bought him a drink afterward, told him exactly what had gone wrong. Most men in that position would have been defensive. Dominic had gone quiet and actually listened. "You're right," he'd said, studying her like she was a problem he very much wanted to solve. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows the difference between confidence and proof," she'd answered. He'd hired her as a consultant within the week, married her within the year. In those early days, he'd valued her mind without reservation, asked her opinion on hires, on contracts, on strategy, on the kinds of decisions that kept him awake. They'd built the early version of Sterling Enterprises together, staying up past 2 in the morning stress-testing business models, arguing over coffee about market positioning, celebrating small wins like they were championships because in those days they were. "You see things I miss," he'd told her once, lying in bed after closing their first significant deal. "You balance me out." She'd fallen asleep that night, believing they were genuine partners. Somewhere along the way, partnership quietly became patronage. It happened so gradually that she didn't recognize the pattern until it had already set like concrete beneath her feet. There was the acquisition meeting, where she'd proposed a different valuation approach, one that the numbers actually supported. Dominic had smiled that particular smile, the indulgent one he reserved for moments when he wanted to appear gracious without actually conceding anything, and patted her hand across the table. "I appreciate the input, sweetheart. We've got this covered." The executives around the table had exchanged glances, not cruel ones, the awkward kind that happens when people witness something uncomfortable and have no idea where to direct their eyes. Vivian had stopped speaking in that meeting. There was an industry profile where a journalist asked Dominic about his support system at home. He'd mentioned her once, in passing, "My wife keeps the home fires burning so I can focus on what I do best," as though her Stanford MBA was a decorative credential, as though the strategic frameworks she developed in those early years had assembled themselves. She'd read that single sentence 11 times. Each reading confirmed she hadn't misunderstood it. There were the dinner parties where Dominic commanded the room, moving from story to story about deals closed and problems conquered, while Vivian refilled wine glasses and steered conversation away from the edges where his arrogance was starting to alienate people. Guests complimented her hosting, asked polite questions about how she kept herself busy. Not one of them knew she was actively managing 3 of Sterling Enterprises' most demanding client accounts. Dominic had stopped mentioning her professional role entirely. When guests asked what she did, he answered before she could open her mouth. Vivian's focusing on personal projects right now. Personal projects? As though her work existed somewhere between a hobby and a pastime. The reality was that she'd moved into a VP-level function, handling the client relationships and contract negotiations that Dominic found tedious or beneath his attention. She was exceptional at it. Clients requested her by name. She'd quietly saved 3 major accounts that Dominic's aggressive personal style had pushed to the edge of termination. He never asked about her work, never acknowledged the detailed emails she'd forward him about problems she'd already resolved. When she mentioned a difficult negotiation over dinner, he'd nod at the approximate rhythm of someone listening, and then redirect the conversation back to his own landscape within 2 sentences. She told herself it was a season. That marriage moved through difficult phases, and this was one of them. That Dominic carried genuine weight and pressure, and that being steady and uncomplaining was what love asked of her right now. So she became all of those things. Completely. She stopped raising her own accomplishments, stopped waiting for credit that wasn't coming, stopped expecting him to ask how her day had gone, because the hollow silence that followed when she told him had started hurting more than not being asked at all. She protected his reputation at every dinner party and industry event, covered for forgotten birthdays and anniversaries with practiced smoothness, managed the household, the staff, the social obligations, the charitable commitments that accumulated with his rising public profile. She made his entire life frictionless. And Dominic, brilliant Dominic, who had built an empire on reading people, on understanding what they needed before they'd identified it themselves, looked at his calm, capable, uncomplaining wife and arrived at a conclusion so wrong it would eventually cost him everything. He decided her steadiness meant she had no fire. He decided her loyalty meant she had no alternatives. He decided her silence meant she would simply remain, indefinitely, exactly where he'd left her. Late at night, long after Dominic had fallen asleep mid-sentence about his own plans, Vivian would lie in their expensive sheets and ask herself questions she wasn't yet brave enough to answer out loud. When had his confidence curdled into something that left no room for anyone else? When had her patience stopped being a virtue and started being a slow disappearance? When had she last felt like a person rather than a feature of someone else's life? Morning would arrive. Dominic would kiss her forehead on his way out, present enough to complete the gesture, absent enough that it meant nothing. And she'd tell herself that tomorrow might feel different. It never did. And Vivian, who had once looked a struggling entrepreneur in the eye and told him that confidence without proof was just noise, had slowly and almost completely vanished inside the life she'd helped him build. Dominic never noticed. That was his first mistake. Believing she had vanished permanently was his second. The first clue was perfume, not Vivian's, something heavier, sweeter, the type that clung to shirt collars and left its trace on car seats long after the journey was over. She'd noticed it on a Tuesday evening when Dominic came home from what he described as a late strategy session. The scent reached her when she leaned in to kiss his cheek, an automatic gesture, years of muscle memory. He pulled back slightly, not dramatically, just enough. "Long day," he said, moving past her toward the bedroom. "I need a shower." Vivian stood in the hallway, that unfamiliar fragrance still present, and felt something cold and specific settle in her stomach. She pushed it away, told herself she was reading too much into nothing. But once you notice the first thread pulling loose, you cannot stop seeing the others. The missed dinners came first. 3 in a single week, each with a reasonable explanation attached. A client emergency, a board issue that couldn't wait, a last-minute flight to Seattle he mentioned only after he'd already landed. Individually, each excuse held. Together they formed a pattern she recognized, but wasn't ready to name. His phone became a guarded object, face down on every surface. Passwords changed without mention, carried into the bathroom when he showered, which he had never done before in all their years together. His attention completed a shift that had been happening gradually for months. He'd stopped pretending to listen when she spoke, stopped making eye contact over breakfast, would walk into rooms where she was sitting and register what seemed like mild surprise at finding her there, as though he'd momentarily forgotten the penthouse was shared. And then there were the photographs. Vivian found them by accident, scrolling through the company's social media accounts while reviewing public engagement metrics, work that was genuinely hers, that Dominic had stopped acknowledging existed. Sterling Enterprises had been tagged in coverage from a technology conference in Austin. The photograph showed Dominic at a networking reception, scotch in hand, laughing at something with his head tilted back. Beside him stood a woman, late 20s, wearing a red dress and the particular ease of someone who knew exactly how she appeared in a room. The woman's hand rested on Dominic's arm. His posture was relaxed in a way Vivian hadn't seen in years, the ease of someone who felt genuinely comfortable rather than someone performing comfort for an audience. She clicked on the woman's tagged profile. Marissa Trent, digital marketing consultant, based in San Francisco. 3 photographs down on Marissa's feed was another image with Dominic. A different event, his arm around her waist this time. Both of them are smiling at something outside the camera's frame. The caption read, "Great minds think alike." Vivian set her phone down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. She spent the following week watching her husband with the careful attention she'd stopped directing at him years ago, back when she'd accepted that close observation only confirmed things she wasn't ready to face. She noticed how he checked his phone and smiled at messages that arrived at odd hours, how his wardrobe had quietly upgraded, shirts appearing in his closet that she hadn't purchased and he hadn't mentioned, how he'd increased his time at the gym to 5 days a week when twice had always been his consistent pattern, how he had stopped touching her entirely, not only in the obvious ways, though physical closeness had faded months ago under the reliable cover of stress and exhaustion. He'd stopped the smaller things. The hand rested briefly on her shoulder as he passed, the absent kiss on her forehead while she worked at the kitchen table, the unconscious physical acknowledgement that they occupied the same space, and that this meant something. She had become furniture, reliable, present, unnoticed. On a Thursday evening, having prepared a dinner Dominic would sit across from without truly seeing, she watched him walk through the front door and knew immediately from his posture that something had been decided. There was a particular quality to the way he set down his briefcase, careful, rehearsed. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. Vivian put down the serving spoon. "All right, I need space." He said the words to a point somewhere between her face and the middle distance. "The company is under enormous pressure. The board is questioning decisions. There are legal matters my lawyers are managing. I need to step back, get perspective, come back to all of it with a clearer head." "Space," Vivian repeated. "There's a leadership retreat. Executives dealing with high-pressure situations. Napa. 3 months, possibly less. It'll give me the distance I need to reset properly." "Will Marissa be there?" The name arrived in the room before she'd fully decided to say it. Dominic's expression shifted, not to guilt exactly, to something closer to irritation at the inconvenience of being seen. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything," Vivian said quietly. "I'm asking you a direct question. Will Marissa Trent be in Napa while you're there?" Silence. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture he used when he needed time to construct rather than respond. "You're making this into something it doesn't need to be." "That isn't an answer. We've grown apart." He pivoted with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years redirecting conversations that weren't going the way he needed. "You have to acknowledge that. We're both working constantly. We barely talk. People change. Relationships move through different phases." "I work for your company, Dominic." Something sharp entered Vivian's voice for the first time. "I manage the client accounts you find inconvenient. I have been quietly resolving the operational problems your decisions create. We barely talk because you stopped listening years ago and I stopped expecting you to." "This is exactly why I need time away," Dominic said, his tone shifting to the register he used with junior employees who questioned his judgment. "You're making my need for recovery about yourself. I'm trying to do the responsible thing for my mental health and my leadership capacity, and I need my wife to support that." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was standing in their kitchen, having spent months pulling away, having been seen in photographs with another woman, having changed his phone password and coming home smelling of someone else's perfume, and he was asking her to be supportive, not of him, of his performance. Vivian looked at her husband. The man she had believed in before was easy. The man she had built something real alongside before he decided real wasn't impressive enough. She saw a stranger wearing a face she'd once loved. "How long?" she asked. 3 months. The company effectively runs itself. Julian and the team manage daily operations. You don't need to worry about any of it. "And me?" she asked. "What exactly am I supposed to do while you're in Napa?" Dominic stepped forward and kissed her forehead, the gesture of a man who had already emotionally left the building and was completing the formalities. "You'll be fine," he said. "You've always been fine. That's what I've always loved about you, Vivian. You're steady. You don't need me hovering over everything. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." He said it warmly, genuinely even, like it was a compliment, like telling a woman she didn't need anything from her husband was something to be proud of, rather than the quietest possible confession of abandonment. "Temporary for whom?" Vivian asked. Dominic paused. "What? You keep saying temporary. 3 months? But temporary for whom? For you, while you figure out what you want? Or for us? For this marriage?" He looked at her with the expression of a man encountering a question he genuinely hadn't considered. "I'll call when I'm settled," he said. He left that night. 2 suitcases. More clothing than 3 months of retreat required. His laptops. His tablets. The anniversary watch she'd chosen carefully, that he'd worn perhaps 4 times. He did not look back at the door. Vivian stood in the kitchen alone, the dinner cooling on the counter, and waited to feel the things she'd been bracing for. The collapse, the grief, the desperate need for him to come back through that door and say he'd been wrong. It didn't come. What came instead was quieter and more significant, a kind of stillness she hadn't felt in years. The particular quality of silence that arrives not when something is empty, but when something that had been pressing against you for a very long time has finally lifted. Dominic had looked at his wife, his calm, capable, endlessly patient wife, and seen someone who would remain exactly where he'd left her. He'd mistaken her steadiness for permanence, her patience for resignation, her silence for the absence of anything worth saying. Have you ever had someone confuse your kindness for weakness? Comment "Respect matters" below if you have. He walked out believing the company ran itself, that Vivian would hold everything together until his return, and that when he came back, he would find everything exactly as he'd left it. He was right that she would be fine. He had no idea what fine was actually going to look like. The penthouse had never felt this large before. Vivian sat on the living room couch, the white Italian leather one Dominic had chosen, because it photographed well for the interior design feature a lifestyle magazine had run on them 2 years ago, and listened to the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind that makes you conscious of your own breathing and aware of every small sound a large empty space produces when it is no longer shared. 3 days since Dominic left. 72 hours of waking to empty space. Making coffee for one person. Moving through rooms that had been decorated according to someone else's preferences, and now simply felt like an expensive museum she happened to sleep in. The humiliation didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, each one finding her in a different room at a different moment, catching her without adequate preparation. Sometimes it was small, standing at the bathroom mirror and remembering the care she'd taken with her appearance every morning, not for herself, not for meetings or clients, but out of a residual hope that Dominic might look at her and actually see her. He never had, not for years. She'd been dressing for an audience that had quietly left the theater without telling her the show was over. Sometimes the waves were larger. Lying awake replaying specific moments, the dinner party where she'd laughed along with his dismissive joke about her professional opinion, The board meeting where he patted her hand and thanked her for her input before completely ignoring it. The profile interview where he'd reduced her entire contribution to keeping the home fires burning. Seeing each moment now without the protective layer of excuse she'd always wrapped around it, she had been complicit in her own disappearance, not through weakness, through a form of love that had stopped being reciprocated so gradually she hadn't noticed the precise moment it became something she was simply maintaining, alone. On the fourth morning, she made herself get up before the city was fully awake. She could not spend another day moving through the penthouse like something unmoored. She needed concrete tasks, practical focus, the kind of forward motion that grief cannot entirely interrupt. Dominic had mentioned paperwork before he left. Legal documents, power of attorney formalities, financial protections his lawyer would send over. Nothing had arrived. This was consistent with a pattern she knew well. Dominic's follow-through applied reliably to the things that served him and inconsistently to everything else. She made coffee and walked to his study. She had not been inside this room in over 2 years. Not because he'd explicitly forbidden it. He hadn't needed to. The one time she'd entered without announcement, carrying lunch during a particularly pressured week when she'd been concerned about how little he was eating. He'd looked up from his desk with an expression that made the boundary perfectly clear without requiring words. "My system works," he'd said carefully. "I'd prefer if things stayed where I put them." She'd left and never returned. Now she stood in the doorway with her coffee cooling in her hand, looking at the large desk positioned to command the best view the window offered. Even his furniture had been arranged to perform authority. The desk was not organized. It was buried. Stacks of folders competing for surface space. Papers spread across each other in overlapping layers. 3 laptops in various configurations of open and closed. The system he'd asked her to respect appeared to be controlled chaos at best. She set down her coffee and began opening drawers. She was looking for the legal documents. She needed to understand what she was being asked to sign, what these financial protections actually covered, what authority she was being handed on paper while Dominic was away. The first drawer held office supplies. The second held older contracts and vendor agreements going back several years. The third held something that stopped her completely, a folder labeled Q2 Financial Review Confidential. She hesitated for only a moment. Then she pulled it out and opened it on the desk. The numbers were not what she expected. Cash flow projections trending downward across 6 consecutive months. Revenue targets missed by margins that were growing wider rather than stabilizing. Operating costs climbed steadily, while income growth had effectively plateaued. The company wasn't in free fall, not yet. But the trajectory of these numbers pointed somewhere specific, and it was not somewhere good. Vivian spread the documents across the desk surface and felt her professional instincts engage in a way they hadn't been invited to for years. She'd spent the early part of her career reading financial data exactly like this, identifying the gap between what numbers claimed and what they actually revealed, finding the problems embedded in projections that had been constructed to satisfy rather than inform. She pulled out the next folder, Brightline Acquisition Internal Assessment. The Brightline purchase had been Dominic's most public strategic move in the past 18 months. He'd announced it at a press conference she hadn't been invited to attend, positioning it as a visionary expansion into a market Sterling Enterprises was perfectly placed to dominate. The financial press had covered it enthusiastically. His profile had risen another notch. The internal documents described a completely different situation. The due diligence report had been prepared by Jennifer Cow, Sterling Enterprises Senior Strategic Analyst. It was thorough, clearly written, and unambiguous in its conclusion. Brightline's client base was contracting at a rate that the acquisition price did not account for. Their core technology required replacement rather than integration. The realistic cost of making the acquisition functional was 3 times the figure that had been used in the public announcement. Jennifer's recommendation at the bottom of the report was a single clear sentence: "Withdrawal from this acquisition is strongly advised." Beneath the report was an email chain. Jennifer had followed up 3 times after submitting her assessment. Each message was professionally worded and increasingly urgent. The third email, sent 10 days before the acquisition closed, outlined specific financial projections showing what the next 2 years would look like if they proceeded. Dominic's reply to that third email was 2 sentences. Your role is analysis, not decision-making. Strategy is my responsibility. They had proceeded. The acquisition had closed. And according to the most recent quarterly figures buried at the bottom of the folder, Brightline was currently losing money at a rate that was accelerating rather than slowing. Vivian kept reading. Staff turnover data covering the past 14 months. 12 senior departures. Exit interview summaries using careful, professional language that nonetheless communicated the same core concern in slightly different phrasing across nearly every document. Leadership decisions were being made without adequate consultation, and the people closest to the operational reality of the company were not being heard. Several exit interviews referenced Dominic by name, wrapped in the diplomatic padding that people use when they want to be honest, but also want a reference letter. Expansion plans spanning 4 new market territories, each accompanied by projections that assumed ideal conditions and timelines that the operational team had formally noted as unrealistic. The formal notes were attached to each plan. There was no evidence they had influenced any decision. Client retention reports. 3 significant account losses in 4 months. The documented reasons were consistent: missed commitments, communication failures, and what one client had described in their exit correspondence as an inability to access stable leadership. Vivian sat back in Dominic's chair and held the full picture in her mind. The confidence he projected publicly, the certainty with which he dismissed warnings, overridden expert analysis, announced bold plans to investors and press. All of it had been operating as a surface over a structure that was quietly developing serious cracks. And when the legal pressure mounted, when the investigations and lawsuits began to make the cracks visible, he had left. Her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but answered. Mrs. Sterling, this is Samuel Reed, General Counsel for Sterling Enterprises. Vivian sat up straighter. She knew Samuel by reputation. Methodical, fiercely protective of the company's legal standing, someone Dominic had hired for his judgment and then progressively ignored whenever that judgment contradicted a preferred course of action. Mr. Reed, what can I do for you? I apologize for contacting you directly. I've been attempting to reach Dominic for several days without success. There are matters requiring executive authorization that cannot wait indefinitely, and given the circumstances, I wanted to make you aware of your position. My position? You remain a secondary signatory on several significant corporate instruments, emergency proxy authorizations, certain financial controls that were established during the company's restructuring 4 years ago. Dominic retained you in those positions at that time. The reasoning given was liability protection. Vivian was quiet for a moment. He never discussed this with me. I suspect he viewed it as a technicality that would never become relevant, Samuel said carefully. The current circumstances have made it relevant. With Dominic unreachable and the board's confidence in leadership continuity actively deteriorating, your authorization carries genuine weight. Does the board have a clear picture of the company's financial situation? The Brightline losses? The turnover? The client departures? A pause that lasted just long enough to be significant. You've seen the internal documents. I'm sitting with them now. Then you understand the urgency behind my call. Samuel's tone shifted slightly, less formal, more direct. Vivian, the company is in a serious position, not irreversible, but the window for effective intervention is not unlimited. Dominic has been making decisions that serve the public. Narrative around Sterling Enterprises, while the operational reality moved in a different direction. The board has been extending goodwill based on his track record. That goodwill is running out. What are you asking me to do? Right now, I'm asking you to understand what you legally can do. The decision about whether to act is entirely yours. He paused again. But I will tell you this, and I want to be clear that I'm speaking beyond my strictly legal role for a moment. You have been the most consistently correct voice about this company's strategic direction for at least 3 years. Every concern you raised was dismissed. Every recommendation that was redirected. The record shows you were right. Dominic didn't listen. No, Samuel said. He didn't. But the board is in a different position now, and they might. After the call ended, Vivian remained in Dominic's chair, surrounded by the documented evidence of decisions made badly and warnings ignored completely. She thought about the woman she'd been 4 days ago, standing in the kitchen watching her husband perform the logistics of leaving, absorbing the casual cruelty of being told she'd be fine as though that settled something. She thought about every meeting where she'd stopped herself from speaking, every dinner where she'd redirected rather than confronted, every morning she'd chosen to believe tomorrow might be different. Then she looked at the documents spread across the desk, and she thought about Jennifer Cow, who had written 3 careful, urgent, completely ignored warnings about a decision that was now costing the company millions. She thought about every person in that building who had been right and had not been heard. She closed the top folder, straightened the stack, picked up her phone. She had a call to return and a decision to make, and for the first time since Dominic had walked out the door with his 2 suitcases and his practiced kiss on her forehead, she wasn't thinking about him at all. Vivian stood across the street from Sterling Enterprises headquarters on a Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, watching the building the way you watch something you are about to walk into differently than you have ever walked into it before. She had been inside this building hundreds of times, for company events and client dinners and the kind of appearances that exist to support someone else's public image. She had smiled in its lobby, waited in its elevators, sat in its conference rooms, and kept her opinions behind her teeth because the room had not been arranged to receive them. Today, the room would need to rearrange itself. She crossed the street and walked through the revolving doors wearing a charcoal suit that she had chosen deliberately, not to impress, but to signal to herself that she was arriving as a professional with a purpose rather than as an extension of someone else's identity. The lobby receptionist looked up and took a moment too long to locate the appropriate response. "Mrs. Sterling, we weren't. Nobody told us to expect you." "Samuel Reed is expecting me," Vivian said. 42nd floor. The receptionist made the call. Vivian crossed the lobby without waiting for the outcome. She had been cleared before she arrived. Samuel had seen to that. In the elevator, she did not check her reflection. She did not rehearse what she was about to say. She had spent 3 days preparing, and the preparation was complete. What remained was simply doing it. The doors opened on the 42nd floor. Samuel was there. He extended his hand, and she shook it with the directness of someone who had decided, somewhere between the lobby and this floor, that she was finished with the particular performance of diffidence she'd maintained for years. "Thank you for coming in," he said. "Thank you for calling," she replied. He led her to a mid-sized conference room, functional rather than formal, chosen deliberately, she suspected, because the main boardroom would have felt like a statement neither of them was ready to make publicly yet. 4 people were seated at the table when she entered. Julian Torres, CFO; Rebecca Silva, VP of Operations; David Park, VP of Client Relations; Jennifer Cow, Senior Strategic Analyst. The same Jennifer Cow whose 3 careful warnings about Brightline had been dismissed in 2 sentences. They stood when Vivian entered, not as a courtesy extended to the CEO's wife. She'd received that kind of standing before, and it felt like being acknowledged without being seen. This was different. This was the instinctive response of people who had been waiting, without quite knowing they were waiting, for someone to walk into the room and take the situation seriously. "I appreciate you all being here," Vivian said, taking a seat in the middle of the table rather than at its head. She had thought about this choice. Sitting at the head before she'd earned the room's trust would have been Dominic's move, claiming authority through positioning rather than demonstrating it through substance. "I'll be direct about why I've asked for this meeting. I've spent the past 3 days reviewing the company's internal financial and operational documents. What I found concerns me significantly. Before I draw any conclusions or take any action, I want to hear from the people who have been inside this situation every day." She looked around the table. "So I'm going to ask questions. I need honest answers, not managed ones. What I hear in this room stays in this room until we decide together what to do with it. Julian nodded. Rebecca's expression shifted almost imperceptibly towards something that might have been relief. What is the immediate risk? Vivian asked. Not the public version. The actual risk. Jennifer spoke first, and Vivian noted that she did so without looking to anyone else for permission. A small thing that told her something significant about how this group had been operating. Brightline is the most urgent problem. We are covering their operating costs while their client base continues to contract. The restructuring that would be required to make the acquisition viable is more expensive than divestment. But a divestment recommendation requires executive authorization and the board's support. What does divestment realistically recover? Approximately 40% of the acquisition cost, based on current asset valuation. Not ideal, considerably better than continuing. What's the alternative if we continue as is? Another 18 months of losses at current rate adds up to a position the company cannot absorb without significantly impacting core operations. Vivian wrote, not performatively, she was genuinely recording the information. What else requires immediate attention? Rebecca spoke. 3 major contracts are inside their renewal window, 60 days or less. All 3 clients have been asking questions about leadership continuity. They're being professional about it, but the message is clear. They are not confident about who is actually running this company, and they will not renew on that basis. Have they been contacted directly since Dominic left? Not at the executive level, David said carefully. There hasn't been an executive level to contact them from. I want direct conversations with all 3 before the end of this week, Vivian said. Not reassurances. Actual conversations. Find out what they need to feel confident and bring that back to me specifically. David wrote it down without hesitation. What decisions are sitting in a queue, waiting for authorization that isn't coming? Julian pulled up his records. 7 items of significance. Senior hire approvals for 2 positions that have been vacant long enough to create operational strain. The Thornhill contract terms. Dominic made commitments in conversation that were never formalized in writing, and Thornhill is now asking for the documentation. 4th quarter budget reallocation. Infrastructure upgrades that the technology team has been requesting for 8 months. Why 8 months? Dominic kept them on his personal review list, Rebecca said, which meant they moved at the pace of his attention. Vivian looked at Jennifer. The expansion plans. The 4 new market territories were announced publicly. What is your honest assessment? Jennifer did not hesitate. They are not deliverable on the announced timeline with current resources. The projections used in the public announcements were built on assumptions that our operational team formally flagged as unrealistic. Those flags were noted and not acted upon. I'd like alternative proposals, Vivian said. Scaled versions, things we can actually deliver and then build from. Not announcements. Results. I can have options ready by Thursday, Jennifer said. Thursday works. Vivian set down her pen. Last question, and I want you to answer it honestly rather than diplomatically. What do the people in this building actually need right now? The table was quiet for a moment. Certainty, Julian said finally, or the closest thing to it that's available. People are frightened. The investigations, the public coverage, Dominic's absence with no clear explanation. There are people in this building who are updating their resumes because they don't know whether there will be a company to come to in 6 months. Are we losing good people? We've had 4 resignations in the past 10 days, David said. All 4 were people we could not afford to lose. Vivian absorbed everything she'd heard. Around the table, 4 people who had been carrying the weight of an increasingly unstable situation watched her with the careful attention of people who had learned not to expect much and were now recalibrating. Here is what I need from each of you by Friday, she said. Julian, real numbers on Brightline. Both scenarios, divestment and restructuring, with honest projections rather than optimistic ones. Rebecca, a complete account of every delayed decision and what continued delay is costing operationally. David, those client conversations. And I want to know specifically what each client needs, not what we wish they needed. Jennifer, The alternative expansion proposals. She looked around the table one final time. I cannot promise you I have the authority to act on what you bring me. What I can promise is that I will listen to it properly and fight for the solutions that actually make sense. Nothing I hear in this room will be dismissed because it's inconvenient. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Julian said, Friday. Everything will be ready. The others confirmed without being asked twice. The meeting continued for another 35 minutes. By the time it ended, Vivian had 6 pages of notes and a clearer picture than she'd had walking in of exactly what the company required and exactly what it had been missing. She also had something she hadn't anticipated walking in with, the team's trust. Not given. Extended, carefully, by people who had been burned by misplaced trust before and were choosing to try again because something about her manner suggested she might handle it differently. She intended to prove them right. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Samuel had framed it carefully in his communications to the 7 members. A leadership continuity discussion, he'd called it, which was accurate in the way that describing a structural repair as maintenance is accurate. Technically, true, considerably understated. All 7 members joined the video conference, their faces arranged on the large monitor at the head of the boardroom, with the guarded expressions of people who had been receiving concerning information for weeks and were now being asked to make a decision about it. Vivian sat at the table alone. Her portfolio is open. Her notes are organized. Her hands are steady. Richard Yates, the board chairman, opened the meeting with the careful neutrality of someone managing a situation he hadn't anticipated needing to manage. Mrs. Sterling, Samuel indicated you wanted to address the board regarding the current leadership situation. We appreciate you coming forward. I want to be honest with you. This is an unusual circumstance, and the board is approaching it with appropriate caution. I understand, Vivian said. I'll be equally honest. What I'm about to present isn't a request for your sympathy or a commentary on my personal situation. It is a straightforward account of where this company is operationally and what I believe needs to happen to stabilize it. She shared her screen. She walked them through the financial position without softening the number. The Brightline situation laid out in both its current cost and its projected trajectory, the client retention data, the staff turnover figures, and what they represented in terms of lost institutional knowledge, the delayed decisions and their operational consequences, the expansion announcements, and the gap between what had been promised publicly and what could realistically be delivered. She presented it the way she had once presented analysis in the early years of the company, before she'd learned to make herself smaller in rooms like this one. Clearly, completely, without performing either alarm or false reassurance. When she finished, Patricia Keene spoke first. Mrs. Sterling, the picture you've drawn is serious. I want to ask you directly, what is your proposed course of action? 3 immediate priorities, Vivian said. Divest from Brightline and recover what we can, rather than continuing to absorb losses. Stabilize the staff situation before we lose more people who cannot be replaced quickly. Renegotiate the domestic opportunities we already have, the Thornhill account and the 3 renewal clients, rather than chasing new territory we're not currently positioned to enter. And who implements this? Richard asked. I do, Vivian said, with full operational authority and board oversight, not as a placeholder. As the person who will be accountable for the outcomes. Patricia leaned forward. What qualifies you for this role, specifically? It was the same question it had always been, asked in boardrooms and dinner parties and profile interviews, in 100 small ways over the course of a marriage to a man who answered it before she could. I built the client relations framework this company still operates on, Vivian said. I wrote the operational protocols that kept us lean during the growth phase. I identified every significant strategic risk this company has faced in the past 3 years. I was right about all of them. The difference between then and now is that then, nobody in a position of authority was listening to me. She met Patricia's eyes directly. I am applying for the authority to act on the analysis I have always been capable of providing. The analysis itself is not new. Only the audience is. The board asked to deliberate privately. Vivian waited in Samuel's office with her portfolio closed on her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who has said everything that needed saying and is at peace with whatever follows. Samuel appeared in the doorway 18 minutes later. 7-0, he said. Interim executive chair. Full operational authority effective immediately. Vivian nodded. She sat with it for a moment, not performing humility, not suppressing satisfaction, just allowing the moment to be exactly what it was. Then she stood, picked up her portfolio, and went back to work. If you believe the people who are overlooked are often carrying more than anyone realizes, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Week 5 of Dominic's retreat found him standing on a private terrace overlooking Napa Valley, espresso in hand, convincing himself he'd made the right decision. The view was extraordinary. Vineyards stretching in every direction, morning light turning the landscape gold, air that smelled like money and distance from consequences. The suite cost more per night than most people earned in a month, and Dominic had stopped noticing this, which was itself a kind of information about who he'd become. Behind him through the open glass doors, Marissa was still asleep. She was uncomplicated in a way that Vivian had stopped being, which Dominic had initially experienced as relief, and was only now beginning to understand as absence. Vivian's complexity had not been a burden. It had been the presence of a full person. What he'd mistaken for simplicity in Marissa was simply the early stage of any relationship where neither person had yet required anything genuinely difficult from the other. He hadn't articulated this to himself yet. He was still in the stage of believing he'd chosen well. His phone buzzed on the terrace railing. Julian Torres. Third time that week. Dominic let it ring out and watched the vineyards. A text arrived 30 seconds later. Julian Torres. Board approved Q4 budget reallocation. Infrastructure upgrades moving forward. I wanted you to have visibility. Dominic read it twice. He hadn't been consulted on the budget reallocation. But then again, he'd given Julian broad authority over routine financial management. This was probably within that scope. He marked the message as read and put the phone face down on the table. The weeks that followed established a rhythm he hadn't anticipated. His phone, which in the first week had demanded attention with the frequency he'd always privately enjoyed, confirmation that things required him, that his absence created problems only his presence could solve, grew quieter with each passing week. Not silent, but quieter in a way that carried meaning he preferred not to examine directly. By week 7, he was in a restaurant in Yountville where the menu had no prices, and the sommelier spoke about each wine as though introducing a person of consequence. Marissa was telling him about a campaign she was developing for a client. He was nodding at the appropriate intervals while reading an email from David Park about the Thornhill account. The email described a contract renewal. Terms had been finalized. The client had confirmed they were satisfied with the direction of the relationship. Dominic didn't remember authorizing any Thornhill negotiation. He scrolled back through his messages, found the thread, saw that he'd been copied on several updates that he'd marked as read without opening. The negotiation had proceeded, concluded, and been filed without requiring a single response from him. "You're somewhere else entirely," Marissa said, "just keeping an eye on things. Are they calling you as much as they were?" Dominic considered the honest answer. "Less. That's good, isn't it?" "Probably," he said. But it didn't feel good. It felt like something he couldn't name yet, sitting at a frequency just below the level of conscious thought. Week 9 arrived with an article. Dominic found it on a Thursday morning, scrolling through his newsfeed while Marissa was in the shower. Business Insider. The headline made him set down his coffee with more care than the gesture required. Sterling Enterprises stabilizes under new leadership. The quiet transformation of Vivian Sterling. He read it in full. Then he read it again. The article described a company that bore the name he'd built and operated almost nothing like the organization he remembered leading. Under Vivian's direction, the piece explained, Sterling Enterprises had divested from Brightline at a recovery rate that preserved significant capital. 3 major contracts had been renewed, one with an expanded scope. Staff turnover had fallen by 60% in 8 weeks. Infrastructure upgrades that had been delayed for the better part of a year were underway and on schedule. A senior executive quoted anonymously had said, "Dominic was brilliant, but chaotic. Vivian is brilliant and deliberate. We're building something that will last now instead of something that looks impressive until it doesn't." Patricia Keene, identified by name, had called Vivian the most underestimated strategic mind she'd encountered in 20 years of board service. Vivian herself, when contacted for comment, had said, "My focus is on the people who make this company function. Our staff, our clients, our partners. Everything else is background noise." Dominic put the phone down on the terrace table. Then he picked it up and called Julian. Julian answered on the second ring, which told Dominic something had changed about how his calls were now received. Not with the urgency of someone grateful for executive access, but with the measured response of someone who had found a functional rhythm and was accommodating an interruption. "Dominic, how is Napa treating you?" "I want to talk about Brightline," Dominic said. "I didn't authorize a divestment." "Vivian did," Julian said. "With board approval. The vote was unanimous. We recovered 41% of the acquisition cost. Given the trajectory the asset was on, the board considered that a strong outcome. I built that acquisition. I spent 14 months developing that strategy." "I know," Julian said. "And the internal analysis at the time indicated it was high risk. The recommendation was withdrawal. You'll recall that recommendation wasn't followed. The sentence landed without aggression, which somehow made it worse. The board had no right to move on something that significant without my direct involvement." "You weren't available for direct involvement," Julian said. "We attempted contact multiple times. There's a record of those attempts." A brief pause. "Dominic, the company needed decisions and the decisions were made. The outcomes have been positive. I'm not sure what you'd like me to say beyond that." Dominic ended the call without a clean conclusion. He sat on the terrace for a long time after, going through emails he'd been filing unread for weeks. The pattern they revealed was consistent and cumulative. Decision after decision. Each one documented and communicated to him through updates he'd ignored. Each one made cleanly and followed through completely. No chaos. No crisis management. No scramble. Just a company being run with a kind of steady, unglamorous competence that doesn't generate many headlines because it doesn't need to. Vivian's name appeared on every significant action item. He found himself reading her emails differently than he'd read anything she'd ever sent him before, not looking for problems to redirect or recommendations to absorb without crediting, reading them as a record of someone exercising precisely the judgment he'd spent years dismissing as peripheral. She had been right about Brightline. She had been right about the expansion timeline. She had been right about the staff situation. She had been right about the Thornhill terms. She had been right, consistently. And he had been the obstacle between her correctness and its application. Marissa found him on the terrace at nearly midnight, the laptop open, his expression carrying something she hadn't seen on him before. "You've been out here for 3 hours," she said. "Reading?" She looked at the screen, saw Vivian's name in an email header, sat down across from him without being invited to, which was a thing she'd started doing with increasing frequency, and which Dominic had stopped noticing meant their dynamic was shifting in ways he hadn't chosen. "She's doing well," Marissa said, not as a question. "The company is doing well," Dominic corrected, with a precision that didn't quite cover what he meant. "Because of her." He didn't answer that. "Can I say something honest?" Marissa asked. "You're going to regardless. You came here because things were falling apart," she said. "The legal situation, the board pressure, the public exposure, and you needed distance from all of it. I understand that, but I think there was something else underneath it." Dominic looked at her. "I think you came here because things were falling apart and you needed to be somewhere that didn't require you to face why. And I think watching Vivian do what she's doing is making that harder to avoid. She's dismantling what I built." "She's saving what you built," Marissa said quietly. "Which means what you built was worth saving, and means she was capable of this the entire time you were deciding she wasn't." Dominic closed the laptop. "Your problem isn't the company," Marissa continued. "Your problem is that you designed your entire sense of yourself around being indispensable. And you're discovering, from a terrace in Napa, that the world you believed required you is not only surviving your absence, it's clarifying in it. She stood up. I think you already know you need to go back, she said. Not to reclaim anything, just to face what's there. After she went inside, Dominic sat alone with the valley dark below him, and the specific discomfort of a man whose most carefully maintained illusion has been disproven not by argument, but by evidence. He had spent years believing he was the thing that held everything together. Vivian was demonstrating, one documented decision at a time, that he had been wrong about that in the same way he had been wrong about everything else. Week 12 arrived with a message from Julian, sent at 6:47 in the morning. Julian Torres, third quarter results finalized. Performance exceeded projections by 22%. The board has extended Vivian's interim appointment indefinitely pending further review. Thought you should be informed. Dominic read it standing in the hotel corridor before he'd had coffee. 22% above projections. Indefinitely. He put the phone in his pocket and stood there for a moment, in the early quiet of a building full of people on their own retreats from their own lives. Then he booked a flight back to San Francisco, not to take anything back, because Marissa had been right. It was time to face what was there. Now the boardroom made complete sense. Standing in that doorway, watching his wife run a meeting that had no awareness of his absence and no particular interest in acknowledging his return, Dominic understood that what he was seeing was not a temporary arrangement or a crisis response or a placeholder situation waiting for him to reclaim his rightful position. This was what the company looked like when it was being led properly. Vivian sat at the head of the table, with the ease of someone who had stopped performing authority and simply exercised it. Her posture was not rigid or assertive in the way of someone working to be taken seriously. It was the relaxed, grounded posture of someone who had resolved that question some time ago and moved on to more important matters. Julian presented the financial summary with focused precision. The precision of someone who trusted that his work would be genuinely engaged with, rather than skimmed for confirmation of a decision already made. Rebecca outlined operational developments without the careful self-editing she'd perfected over years of presenting to someone whose response to unwelcome information was to redirect blame. David spoke about the client relationships he'd rebuilt with the quiet confidence of someone whose contributions had been acknowledged and whose judgment had been trusted. Jennifer Cow contributed strategic analysis, without first reading the room to determine whether her opinion would be tolerated. The meeting functioned the way a well-led organization was supposed to function, and almost never did under Dominic's tenure, as a genuine exchange between capable people who trusted the structure they were operating within. Dominic had sat in the middle chair because there was nothing else available to him. Every instinct for reclaiming control, walking to the head of the table, calling a halt to the proceedings, asserting his identity as the company's founder, had dissolved the moment he registered the room's complete indifference to his arrival. They were not afraid of him. More accurately, they no longer needed to be. He watched his wife close the meeting with precision and clarity. Action items assigned. Timelines confirmed. No ambiguity left in the room for people to carry out into the corridor and interpret separately. Just clear direction from someone who understood that the primary function of leadership was making it straightforward for capable people to do their best work. The executives filed out. Several acknowledged Dominic, with the brief professional courtesy extended to someone whose presence is noted without being particularly significant. Julian paused and said it was good to have him back, and managed to make the statement simultaneously genuine and entirely non-committal. Then the room was empty, except for the two of them. Vivian gathered her materials at her own pace. She had been in a hurry for other people's timelines for long enough. She moved at the speed that her own judgment indicated was appropriate, which happened to be efficient without being rushed. "We should talk," Dominic said. "Yes," Vivian agreed. "We should." She led him not to the main boardroom, but to the smaller office she'd established for herself during the first week of her appointment, a room that had previously been used for storage, and that she'd converted into a functional, simply furnished workspace with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the city, without making a performance of the view. Nothing in the room had been chosen by Dominic. He sat across from her and noticed that the version of himself that had always known how to control the temperature of a conversation was not available to him. He didn't know where it had gone, exactly. Somewhere between Napa and this chair. "I didn't expect it to feel like this," he said. "Like what, specifically?" "Walking in there, seeing the room not react, watching you." He stopped, started again, more honestly. "Watching you lead in a way that I recognized, that I knew was right, and knowing I'd spent years making sure it couldn't happen." Vivian looked at him steadily. "Is that what you understood it as? Making sure it couldn't happen?" "I understood it as keeping things in their proper order," Dominic said. "Which is a version of the same thing, I suppose. I just didn't frame it that way to myself. People rarely do." A silence settled between them, not hostile. The particular silence of a conversation that has decided to be honest and is taking a moment to prepare for what that required. "I was wrong," Dominic said. "Tell me specifically," Vivian said. "Not in general. Specifically. I was wrong about you. About what you were capable of. About what you were already doing that I wasn't acknowledging. About what the company would look like if you were actually given the authority to act on your own judgment." He paused. "And I was wrong about us. About what I was asking you to accept as normal. About what I was taking from you while believing I was providing for you." "Wrong about the company?" Vivian said quietly. "Or wrong about me?" "Both," Dominic said. "Completely. Without qualification." Vivian nodded once, not as acceptance, as acknowledgement that he had said the true thing rather than the managed thing, which was its own kind of progress. "Do you understand what this actually costs?" she asked. "Not the legal settlement. Not the board restructuring or the reputational damage or the professional consequences. The actual cost. Tell me." 3 years of work performed without credit. Client relationships maintained in your name while you took the recognition in press statements. Strategic problems I identified and resolved before they could reach you, which meant you never knew they existed, which meant you never knew I had solved them. Staff concerns were addressed quietly because I knew that if they escalated they would create a crisis that would somehow become my responsibility to manage anyway. She was not speaking with anger. She had moved through anger some time ago and arrived at something cleaner and more durable. "You left me the weight of a company in serious trouble," she continued. "You handed me the responsibility without the title, the accountability without the authority, the work without the recognition, and you did this not once as a crisis response, but as the consistent shape of our professional relationship for years. You organized our marriage so that your contributions were visible, and mine were structural. Structural things don't get noticed until they fail." Dominic said nothing, because there was nothing to add that would improve on her accuracy. "And then you left," she said, "with 2 suitcases and a kiss on my forehead and the information that I would be fine, which I was. But not in any sense you had considered when you said it." "I know. Knowing it now is a different thing from not having happened," Vivian said. "I want to be clear about that. Understanding the damage after the fact is not the same as the damage not existing." "I understand that. Do you understand what it cost me that wasn't professional?" she asked. "The years of making myself smaller to make room for you, of protecting your image at dinner parties while you answered questions about my life before I could open my mouth, of telling myself every morning that the version of our marriage I was experiencing was a temporary phase rather than the permanent terms you'd decided on without consulting me." Dominic felt something in his chest that he didn't have a ready name for. Not guilt, exactly, though guilt was present. Something larger, the specific weight of understanding, fully and without defense, the complete shape of harm you've caused someone. "I am sorry," he said. "I know that isn't a sufficient response to what you've just described. I'm not offering it as sufficient. I'm offering it as true." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "I believe you," she said. "That matters, and I want you to know it matters. But belief in your remorse doesn't resolve what comes next, and I'm not going to make a decision about what comes next from a place of either loneliness or hope that sufficient apology changes the underlying pattern. I've learned to make decisions from a clearer position than that. What does that mean for us? It means I don't know yet, she said, and I'm not going to manufacture an answer to relieve the discomfort of that uncertainty. I spent years manufacturing comfort for situations that deserved honest discomfort. I'm done with that. She picked up a folder from the desk and set it in front of him. The board has restructured your role. You retain the CEO title because removing it publicly creates instability that affects people who had no part in your decisions. But operational authority is now a shared structure with mandatory board consultation on all significant matters. Samuel negotiated the terms of your legal settlement. The compliance requirements are extensive and not negotiable. Dominic opened the folder. Read through the restructured terms methodically. The restrictions were significant. The authority he'd once exercised without consultation had been replaced by a framework of oversight that would have been unthinkable to the version of himself who'd stood at penthouse windows describing the future like he owned it. This is a fundamental change, he said. This is accountability given a formal structure, Vivian replied, which is what should have existed from the beginning. He closed the folder. And my role in the company, day to day? You contribute where your strengths are genuine. External relationships, certain investor communications, situations where your profile and network open doors that benefit the company. You do not override operational decisions. You do not circumvent the team structures that have been built in your absence. You do not walk into rooms expecting them to reorganize around you. And if I disagree with a direction, you say so clearly and through the proper channels, the same way everyone else does. Dominic absorbed this. The man who had once run this company as an extension of his own will, whose instinct had been final on everything from market strategy to the font on the building, was now being told he operated within the same structure as his colleagues. He didn't argue. Something had shifted in Napa. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but across 12 weeks of watching evidence accumulate that the story he'd told himself about his own indispensability was simply not true. The argument he might have made 6 months ago wasn't available to him, because he'd watched it disproven in real time by the woman sitting across from him. Our marriage, he said. Where does that stand? Vivian was quiet for long enough that the silence had its own content. I loved who I understood you to be, she said finally. The person from the early years. The one who listened to a stranger at a networking event, told him what he'd done wrong and actually heard it. I don't know with certainty whether that person still exists inside everything that came after, or whether I constructed him partially from my own need to believe in something. He exists, Dominic said. Then he has work to do, Vivian said. Not for me, for himself. Because the version of you that existed for the past several years caused serious harm to people who trusted you, and that requires more than remorse. It requires sustained change that isn't performed for an audience. She stood and moved toward the door. There's a department meeting at 3. You're welcome to attend. Not to lead it. To listen. She paused at the door. That's where it begins. If it begins. With you learning what it actually means to be in a room without needing to own it. She left. Dominic remained in the chair, in the simply furnished office that Vivian had built from a storage room, while he was in Napa convincing himself he was indispensable, and sat with the full weight of everything that was true. He had built something real. That was also true, and he was not required to erase it, but he had harmed someone in the building, someone who had contributed to it in ways he'd never acknowledged, and had continued contributing after he'd given her every reason to stop. The question of whether that could be repaired was not his to answer alone or on his preferred timeline. He understood that now. It was, all things considered, the most important thing he'd understood in years. Should Vivian ever fully trust him again, or respect something that can't be rebuilt once it's been dismantled so completely? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story has stayed with you, subscribe, because the final part is where everything lands. 6 months after Dominic walked back into that boardroom and found his wife running everything he'd abandoned, Sterling Enterprises looked fundamentally different from the inside. The building was the same. The name on the 42nd floor hadn't changed. The lobby still had the same marble floors, and the same revolving doors, and the same view of Montgomery Street that Dominic had once stood in front of, feeling like a man who had correctly understood his place in the world. What had changed was everything the building contained. Departments that had operated in careful, competitive isolation under Dominic's leadership now collaborated with the ease of people who had been shown that cooperation produced better outcomes than rivalry. Meetings that had once been performances staged for one person's approval were now working sessions where decisions were actually made rather than ratified after the fact. Junior employees raised concerns without first calculating the political cost of being right about something a senior person had missed. The culture has shifted in the way that cultures only shift when the person at the top makes it structurally safe to do so, rather than simply announcing that things will be different. The numbers confirmed everything the atmosphere suggested. 2 consecutive quarters of 18% growth. Not the explosive, headline-generating kind that looks impressive in press releases and creates problems 6 months later, but the compounding kind that builds on itself and produces something durable. Client retention at its highest measured point in the company's history. Staff turnover continues its downward trajectory. The Thornhill account, which had been 48 hours from formal termination when Vivian had taken the situation in hand, had expanded its engagement by 40% and referred 2 new clients within the same quarter. The Brightline divestment, which Dominic had called an admission of failure from a Napa terrace, had recovered capital that funded the infrastructure upgrades the technology team had been requesting for the better part of a year. Those upgrades had reduced operational costs measurably and removed several bottlenecks that had been quietly limiting the company's capacity for months. Patricia Keene had made a statement at the most recent board meeting that circulated afterward through the executive floor with the quiet velocity of something people wanted to share. She had said that in 23 years of board service across multiple organizations, she had rarely observed a leadership transition executed with a combination of speed, clarity, and genuine care for people that Vivian had demonstrated. She had said this not as a compliment to Vivian personally, but as an observation about what was possible when the right person was finally given the authority that their capability had long since earned. The Forbes cover had appeared in month 4. Vivian had framed it and placed it not in her office, but in the main corridor outside the conference rooms, at eye level, where every person in the building passed it multiple times each day. When Samuel had asked her why she'd put it there, rather than keeping it privately, she'd said that the story it represented wasn't hers alone. It belonged to every person who had kept the company functioning during the period when its leadership had been absent in every meaningful sense. The cover was their evidence, as much as hers. This was the distinction that defined her leadership, and that no amount of external coverage quite managed to fully capture. The difference between someone who leads to be recognized and someone who leads because the work requires it, and they are the person available who can do it properly. Dominic was quieter now, not diminished. Quieter in the specific way that people become when they have stopped filling every available silence with proof of their own significance and started listening to what the silence contains. He attended meetings. He contributed in the areas the restructured framework had identified as genuinely his. External relationships where his profile still opened doors. Communications that benefited from his established credibility. Specific partnership conversations where his history with the company added context that was difficult to replicate. He did this work without requiring it to arrive with a title or a public acknowledgement or the performance of indispensability that had once been as automatic to him as breathing. The legal settlement had been finalized in the 2nd month after his return. The financial penalties were significant. The compliance framework imposed on his role was extensive and designed to be permanent rather than provisional. Some professional relationships had not survived the exposure of the past year and would not be rebuilt, regardless of what came next. Certain doors were closed in ways that no amount of rehabilitation would reopen. He had begun to make a different kind of peace with consequences than he had previously believed himself capable of, not the peace of someone who has rationalized their way into comfort, but the harder, more honest peace of someone who has looked at what they've done without the protective layer of justification and decided to continue anyway. Differently, with the damage acknowledged rather than managed. He was not performing change. He was doing the slower, less visible work of actually becoming someone whose judgment could eventually be trusted again. This required, above everything else, the willingness to be wrong in front of people without making their witness of his wrongness into a problem they were responsible for solving. He was getting better at it. Vivian had observed this without comment and without adjustment to her own position. She had not rewarded his progress with warmth she didn't yet feel, or with reassurances she wasn't ready to offer. She had simply noted it, the way a person notes accurate information, registering it, filing it, allowing it to exist without yet knowing what it meant for the larger question. They had developed a way of being around each other that neither of them had a precise word for. They worked in the same building, attended some of the same meetings, occasionally shared coffee in the small kitchen adjacent to the executive floor before the day fully assembled itself around them. These conversations were honest in a way that their marriage at its worst had entirely lost. Not warm exactly, not distant either, but real in the particular way that things become real when the pretense that once surrounded them has been removed and what remains has to be dealt with as it actually is. Vivian had her downtown loft with its large windows, and the specific pleasure of a space arranged entirely according to her own preferences. She had described this to Dominic once without sentimentality. The experience of choosing where things went without reference to anyone else's opinion had been unexpectedly significant, she'd said, because it had shown her how thoroughly she'd organized herself around his preferences for so long that she'd stopped noticing they weren't hers. Dominic had listened to this without defending himself, which was the correct response, and one that would not have been available to him a year earlier. Their marriage existed without resolution, which was not the same as existing without meaning. Some things require more time than circumstances allow before they can be properly understood. Vivian had made her peace with uncertainty, not as a form of suspension, but as a form of honesty, an acknowledgement that the answer to the question of what remained between them would arrive when it arrived, and that forcing it earlier would only produce an answer shaped by pressure rather than truth. December came with cold air and the particular stillness that settles over a city when the year is close enough to its end that its shape has become visible. Snow fell on a Thursday morning, light and brief, turning Montgomery Street quiet for 20 minutes before the city resumed its usual pace. Vivian was standing near the lobby windows watching it when she heard the elevator open behind her. Dominic crossed the lobby and stood beside her. He didn't announce himself or find a way to make his arrival the focal point of the moment. He simply stood where there was space and looked at what she was looking at. They watched the snow together without filling the silence. "Board presentation today?" Vivian said eventually. "I know. The year-end strategic plan." He paused. "The external partnership section. That's mine." "It's well prepared," she said. "I read the materials last night." "I had Jennifer review the strategic framing," he said. "She caught something I'd missed. I incorporated her feedback." Vivian glanced at him briefly. A year ago this sentence would not have existed. Dominic Sterling did not incorporate feedback. He received it, acknowledged it, and continued with his original intention. "Good," she said simply. The snow outside was already thinning, the city reasserting itself through it. "I've been thinking about something," Dominic said. "About the early years. About what I told you when we closed our first real deal. That you saw things I missed. That you balanced me out." "I remember." "I meant it then," he said. "And then I spent years building a version of the company and the marriage where that being true was inconvenient. Where you're seeing things I missed was a challenge to something I needed to protect, rather than an asset I was fortunate to have." He wasn't looking for a response. He was saying a true thing because it was true, not because he expected it to produce a particular outcome. "Leadership isn't what I thought it was," he said. "I thought it was the strongest presence, The one with the answers before the questions were finished. The one the room organized itself around. He paused. What you've been doing this year is something different. Listening until you actually understand what you're hearing. Making space for people who know things you don't. Being willing to be wrong without turning your wrongness into someone else's emergency. It's not complicated, Vivian said. It just requires caring more about the outcome than about the credit. That's the part I struggled with. I know, she said. I watched you struggle with it for years. Julian came through the lobby doors, saw them both, raised a hand in the easy greeting of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the particular configuration of this situation. Rebecca followed a minute later, nodded to Vivian, with the warm brevity of someone whose respect had been earned rather than assumed. Neither of them treated Dominic with coldness or with the deference of the old days. They treated him as a colleague, whose contributions existed within a structure that was no longer arranged around him, which was both less than what he'd had and considerably more honest. Vivian finished her coffee. Early start, she said, moving toward the elevators. I'll be up in a few minutes, Dominic said. She nodded and walked away. He watched her go. This woman he had spent years looking at without seeing, and understood that the most remarkable thing about her had never been her patience or her capability or even the particular quality of her intelligence. Though all of these had been real and considerable, the most remarkable thing was that she had known her own worth throughout every year of being told, in 100 small and consistent ways, that it was less than it was. She had known it when she bought a struggling entrepreneur a drink and told him clearly what he'd done wrong. She had known it through every meeting where she'd been patted on the hand and thanked for her input. She had known it when he'd walked out the door with 2 suitcases and told her she'd be fine. She had known it when she sat down in his chair. She had simply been waiting for the conditions under which everyone else would know it too. The elevator doors closed. Dominic stood alone in the lobby for a moment longer, with the snow outside thinning to nothing and the city resuming its full volume, and thought about what it cost to finally see something clearly. How much had to be lost before vision corrects itself? How much damage accumulates in the space between what is true and what a person is willing to acknowledge? Then he walked toward the elevator. He had a meeting to attend, and a contribution to make within a structure he hadn't designed and didn't control. It was, he was finding, enough. It was in fact considerably more meaningful than everything he'd had before, because this time what he contributed was genuinely his, offered without the inflation of ego or the performance of indispensability, and received on its actual merits. That was new, and it was, he was slowly understanding, the only version of himself worth being. There is a lesson in Vivian Sterling's story that has nothing to do with corporate strategy or marital failure or the specific mechanics of a boardroom power shift. The lesson is this: the people who hold things together rarely hold the title that reflects it. They operate in the structural layer, the one that becomes visible only when it's removed, the one that everyone suddenly notices when it's gone. They are the ones whose warnings get filed rather than acted on, whose contributions get absorbed into someone else's narrative, whose steadiness gets mistaken for simplicity by people who have confused loudness with intelligence. These people are not waiting to be rescued. They are waiting for the moment when circumstances finally align with what they have always known about themselves. Power without respect is a performance that eventually runs out of audience. It produces results that look like loyalty and function like fear. And when the conditions change, when the fear is removed, when the audience finds somewhere else to direct its attention, what remains is a room that has simply stopped organizing itself around you. Love without honor decays from the inside, not in dramatic moments that announce themselves, but in the accumulated weight of small choices. Every time you answer for someone before they can speak, every time you receive credit for work that wasn't only yours, every time you look at a person who is fully present and choose to see only what is useful to you in that moment. And the person on the other side of that love, the one absorbing the small choices, making room, adjusting, maintaining, that person does not disappear just because you stop looking. They are still there. They have always been there. They are simply, finally, done waiting for you to notice. If this story stays with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that quiet strength is still strength, that being overlooked is not the same as being without value, and that the person carrying the most is not always the one with the loudest voice or the biggest title. Subscribe for more stories like this one. Leave a comment with the lesson you're taking from Vivian's journey. Every single one gets read. And remember, the person you are currently underestimating is building something. Whether you'll be part of it when it's finished depends entirely on what you do next.